Welcome to Experiments in Leadership, practical insights for Caribbean business leaders. Hi, and welcome to Cyber Resilience for Caribbean Leaders and to the second episode on the topic, what Caribbean business leaders must know in choosing the right cybersecurity provider. I'm your host, Anthony Subero. In our prior episode on this topic, we discussed the benefits of outsourcing. And we shared that these benefits are providing skills that are hard to hire locally, offering 24/7 monitoring that small internal teams cannot manage effectively, and lastly, that we believe to be the most significant is a good cybersecurity provider brings a global and regional experience in cyber resilience strategies and cyber attack incidents that your team may not have the experience in, but your organization must be prepared to manage. In that episode, we also shared 5 recommendations in selecting the right cybersecurity provider for your company. Recommendation 1, business alignment before technology. The right provider must talk about business risk and not just about security tools. Leaders, remember, cyber resilience exists to protect business outcomes, not to sell impressive tools and technology. Recommendation 2, the provider must prove their experience with working with companies in your industry, your level of cybersecurity maturity, and also your short and long-term business resilience objectives. Recommendation 3, they have to provide clear definition of scope, roles, and responsibilities with measurable outcomes in their service delivery. All right, now this is critical because at the end of the day, you need these definitions, or what I call measurable outcomes, to effectively determine how well they're providing their service. But equally important, you need to discern what is your area of responsibility versus theirs. Okay? Recommendation 4, they must be strong in data protection, identity management and monitoring, and incident response. Why? Well, for 2 reasons. That's the reason why you hire them. But equally important, they will be, in fact, either monitoring or housing some level of your data. So therefore, they have to show you clearly how they're going to be monitoring your data and how would you determine the level of protection that they would be enforcing in relation to protecting not only your data but your reputation. And of course, the 5th recommendation is your vendor must have a partnership mindset and not see you as a contract or a transaction. Now, this is critical. I've always shared this with my team. What we sell is not really cybersecurity services. What we really selling is trust. The trust is that if anything were to happen, we will be there for our customer, right? And we're not the only one. There are many other companies operate within that philosophy. So if you have a cybersecurity provider that see you more as a contract, well, say, okay, well, the contract didn't say that, so we're not going to do that. Or the contract said Y, and that's the only reason we could do X. That's something you need to be mindful of. Always remember, your success is their success. All right? So let's move into the second part of this topic, which is what to keep in-house versus what to outsource. And based on my experience, this is where many organizations sometimes get it wrong. I've said this before, not only to myself, but to leaders. You can outsource cybersecurity capabilities, but you must never outsource accountability. Therefore, I'm providing 4 areas that I believe you must keep in-house. Now, as we progress, you will see that these areas are not IT related, but require oversight and authority within a business context. Area number 1, cybersecurity strategy and risk ownership. This involves building cybersecurity in your risk appetite statement. How do you invest into systems in relation to optimizing return on security investments? Remember, leaders, cybersecurity initiatives, it's just like any other strategy. It involves making choices, selecting the best project based on your cyber resilience objectives that you want to ensure. All right. Now, here your provider can advise you and assist you, but ultimately the final decision sits with the company. The second area is governance, policy, and system access approvals. Now, this relates to developing and implementing your own security policies. Again, the provider can help you. Could they have standard templates if you don't have any type of policy templates? But who gets access and why do they get access? And remember, we talked about that zero trust principle in a prior episode, where you have to take almost a minimalist approach where you only give users access to resources that they need and not versus what they want. All right, and that's where the policy and the access management control comes into play. Now, this is a pet peeve of mine, and let me explain why. I have seen companies that go ahead and outsource their IT support, and I know it's not equivalent to a cybersecurity provider, but I want to drive home the whole issue of outsourcing. So they went ahead and issued the IT support. So that's where you have problems with your laptops, so you may have problems with your PCs, your network, and the outsource where the company will come in and fix these issues. In some cases, they will set up new laptops, new equipment, and as well implement the access policies for the user to use those particular endpoint devices. Now here where it gets tricky. That same company, all right, that provide that IT support, they use them to outsource the what we call user support, where passwords that are locked or locked out are reset. So think about this. So I'm giving the same company the ability to set up users, all right, and I'm also giving them the functionality to reset users that are locked out. Now, to me, that is basically giving my provider the keys to my house, the alarm code, and the password when the alarm goes off and the police calls. These functions must be kept separate, and I always recommend that the user reset functionality should stay in-house. Area number 3, business context and asset classification. All right, and this involves the prioritization of systems based on criticality that can impact your business. All right, why? Well, only you could determine whether or not if a system were to go down, what the implications would be for your business, what type of regulatory implications they would have, the level of reputational damage, what downtime is acceptable to you. These are things, in fact, I always recommend you should have clearly determined and approved even before selecting any provider. Area number 4, which is final incident and communication decisions. And I've seen this, I know this is something that has not happened frequently, but I saw it on 2 occasions where the service provider was actually leading the communication strategy relevant to an attack. All right, that has to be kept in-house. Okay, your customer communication, your regulatory notification, the board and executive messaging. All right. Now, don't get me wrong, your provider can support your response, but the leadership within that organization have to manage the communication and also manage the impact of that communication. All right. Now, let's discuss what we can outsource. And it goes back to the benefits I mentioned earlier. So number 1 is 24/7 monitoring and threat detection. And this involves SOC services, log monitoring, and 24/7 XDR services. So XDR services is not full-blown SIM, all right, that you will see in some organizations or some service providers. But what it does, it gives you coverage in terms of endpoint and your network, all right? And honestly, even with this being outsourced, can have a huge impact in reducing any possible data breach. Area number 2, advanced security tools and expertise. Now this is where now you have a full-blown SIM, which is a bigger version of the XDR monitoring. You can also have threat intelligence and what I call the CISO. Now, I don't call it that. That's the general term of it. But basically, rather than having a full person, FTE as we call it in HR, you can actually hire a virtual CISO, all right, and he or she will allocate a certain amount of his or her time in supporting your policy development, developing your incident response plan, working with your team to test it, all right. Now, these are expensive as its own, but what happens with service providers is because they would have one or two or three customers sharing common infrastructure, the cost tends to spread across clients, which makes the service a lot more affordable. All right, and then you have incident response and digital forensic. Now, I always say this before, and this is a conversation I've had with customers, and sometimes I feel that they feel we're trying to push something down their throat. But always remember, when something goes wrong, this is not the time to learn. All right, so having an experienced provider that can help you to contain the attack, conduct forensics to discern the method of the attack, but also to protect evidence for your insurance and give you recovery guidance so that you can restore your services as quickly as possible. This is a key value, all right, that the cyber provider brings to you. Always remember, experience matters most in a crisis. And then you have vulnerability testing and cyber resilience assessments, and that brings about independent testing and assessments that can reveal blind spots where your internal team may normalize over time. And then lastly, security awareness and advisory services, where they work with you to improve your, what I call your training program that elevates your culture, all right, without draining your internal capacity, all right. So having shared what to keep in-house and what you can outsource, a question I always ask is, what's the best approach in developing and maintaining an effective cyber resilience program? And my answer always lands on a hybrid approach. So from an in-house perspective, you want to control the business, and that relates to your control strategy, your governance, the business context and classification of your assets or your systems, and vendor management. All right, the vendor management has to be controlled by the organization, and of course, any final decisions in terms of selection of initiatives and communication in relation to, God forbid, you are in fact attacked, right? On the outsourcing side, outsource your monitoring, all right? The tooling, as I mentioned to you, service providers have platforms. These platforms and the cost for these platforms are shared across clients, all right? So it makes the service much more affordable. The ability to detect, how do you respond to attack, and of course they bring their expertise that helps you bring that global and regional experience that they can contextualize based on your specific needs. For me, this model maximizes your limited budgets, but it also strengthens the team that you have while keeping control under the leadership and reduce your business risk. So as we wrap up, I would like to close off with a level of reflection, which is, we don't outsource cybersecurity because we are necessarily weak. I believe we outsource it because, one, attacks are global, and we talk about that, increasing in complexity and frequency. The harsh reality is skills are becoming scarce. That's a reality. And as such, resilience requires scale, and that's what these cybersecurity providers bring. Therefore, the real question is not whether to outsource, is how do you do it intelligently? And that, in my view, translates in building a strong cyber defense against cyber threats that fits with your risk profile. And that requires business leaders to choose partners that will strengthen you while keeping the accountability where it belongs, which is within your organization. All right, so that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for staying with me as we work together in improving your cyber resilience. All right, I'm your host, Anthony Subera. Until next time, please keep well. Aye, if this episode brought any value to you, we kindly ask you share it with others. If you need help on your cyber resilience journey, you can find us on www.stratos-cyber.com. Until we meet again, keep well.